Now, at this time, Moses had selected Aaron to do a lot of the work. And there were those of different clans and tribes who felt there was a little, I think the word's nepotism, where it was family favoritism, that Moses picked Aaron because it was his brother. So they grumble and they complain, and God steps in and he says, okay, I'll decide this for you. So when you read this, he says, take a rod from each of the families, of the 12 families, and put them all in this jar or whatever, and then put it in the tabernacle, in the holy place. Then tomorrow, you go get it, and each one of them had to write their name on it, Aaron, Jacob, whatever the tribe was. You go get it, so they go and get it the next day, and of all the 12 rods, only one budded, and that was Aaron's rod. It had the buds coming out on it, and eventually those buds turned into almond, like nuts. And Aaron was from the tribe of Levi, so he represented the tribe of Levi. So with that, God said that this will show you that I have selected him. It's not a matter of just Moses selected him. I did, because his rod will bud. The tribe whose rod buds, that will be the one that I've selected as the priesthood. And when you read that, you'll see that it was Aaron's. And through that, God says, okay, we've settled this, and it's good because now all you people don't have to die because you were coming against my selected person. Okay, so that was the one of the first things that God set for them in this covenant was the government, and that needed to be established. You have to have leaders. We don't always like our leaders, but somebody needs to be in a position where they will make the final decision. That's what was it? Harry Truman said, the buck stops here. When decisions had to be made as president, he would be the final say. He couldn't pass it on to anybody else. So God had to set up a form of government for them. Moses as the leader, the elders as those that would communicate to those in their tribes, and then the priest who would perform the functions that no one else would be allowed to perform. So the next thing that God provides for them the Ten Commandments. And that's Exodus 20. Exodus 20, 1 through 17. When you get a chance, read that. Exodus 21 through 17. Read through that. It's really interesting to grasp what the 10 are. Sometimes people have a hard time with being able to quote what the 10 commandments are, and don't ask me to do it because I don't think I could. But read that. There's little instructions in with them. It's not just don't covet, don't kill, don't steal. There's other instructions in there where God says that I'm saying this. This is what you're to do. When Moses went up on the mountain in Exodus, it says that God gave him instructions, and then he came back down. He told the people, and they said, "Yeah, we'll agree with all of this." And then Moses God says, "All right, get the people close to the mountain. Don't let them touch the mountain, but get them close, and I will speak to them directly." Well, there's thunder, lightning, shaking, and all this going on, and the people say, "Don't let God talk to us. Moses, you talk to us. We don't want God to talk to us," because they were so frightened from it. So Moses would have to read to them what was to be said. And that's, when you read through there, you're going to see how they responded to God speaking to them. They didn't want anything to do with it. I think it's in verse 18 where they say, "Moses, you talk to us. Let God talk to you, and then you talk to us." You ever have anybody say that? They'll say, "Well, let's go see what Bill says." Okay, you go talk to Bill, and then you tell me what he said. Yeah. "Mom, will you go talk to Dad and ask him if I can do such and such?" They didn't want to go to Dad. It was okay to go to Mom, her talk to dad, and then come back. Well, that's kind of where the Israelites were. I know you still. Let's ask your mother, see what she says. And you know how many kids have said, well, Dad, can I do such and such? What'd your mom say? She said to come and ask you. Okay, so they got the 10 Commandments. The next thing he gave them was the civil law. And that's in Exodus 21 and 23. It covers 3 chapters. And in this civil law, he covers everything from what happens if your ox gourds your neighbor's ox, or you take somebody's daughter, or your cattle get loose and they trample my crops. He covers everything. Everything. And even today, even though we don't follow Israel's civil law in this respect, many of their civil laws, when you read it, you'll say, oh, we have a law just like that. It's sometimes it's a law that shows what punishment is to be met out, and then sometimes it's a law that will say what restitution has to be. And much of our law is built on these common laws, or these laws that God gave to the nation of Israel. The other thing he gave them as far as his law was his instructions on feasts. That 3 times a year they would have this celebration. And they were celebrations honoring him, or celebrations of thankfulness. These all fit within the law. I mean, haven't given instructions for a feast doesn't sound like a law, does it? But all these things fall under that same category. Everybody have this? Well, my time went too fast. Did somebody go late in the other class? Oh, it was just yeah. Okay, so the 3 feasts, and I'm not giving you all of this just to give you a whole bunch of stuff. I'm giving you this so that you recognize that when someone writing in the New Testament says something about the law, they're not necessarily talking about the 10 Commandments. They could be talking about any aspect that we've already talked about. The government, the civil law, the ritual law. Here it's the feasts, and there's 3 feasts a year, and this again is in Exodus 20, 23, and 24. No, the other one was 21 and 23. This is 23 and 24. And the 3 feasts are the unleavened bread, and unleavened bread was their time of, this feast was their time of celebration of coming out of Egypt. Remember the story when they come out of Egypt, just before they left? God said, make your bread, but don't put any leaven in it, because you may have to leave in a moment's notice and it won't have time to rise. So whenever you think of the unleavened bread, it had to be with that, it was within that week of their deliverance. So they would celebrate every year for 7 days this feast of the unleavened bread, and there was not allowed to be any leaven in the house during that time. They would have to get rid of all of it. And then just the bread would be flat bread. I tried making some for my Sunday school, was it a Sunday school class? Yeah, I think it was. I was thinking it was here. I tried 3 weeks in a row to make unleavened bread, and I think 1 out of the 3, someone said it was somewhat palatable. I mean, I just took recipes that I found online that were supposed to be Jewish recipes for unleavened bread. Not too good. And the second one that they're to honor is the Feast of Harvest. Now, this we will probably think more of as the first fruits. The first fruits. Now, maybe as we go along in this class, we'll come back and we'll talk more about these. But briefly, this one is a case where they've planted, and I don't know if any of you have ever done gardens. Usually the first fruit, the first tomato you pick, or the first beans, whatever it is, they're usually the best. The first ones of the fruit of the harvest. And what they were to do with this first fruit, they were to select that, pick that, and then give it to the Lord, take it to the Lord's house as an offering to him. So, and it would be for the priest, to feed the priest. But the idea is they were taking, after their labor, again, like I say, I don't know if any of you have ever put in a garden, but it's a lot of work. You have to till the ground and toil it and break it up, and then you plant your seeds and you water it and you do the weeds and all that stuff. And the first things that you select is always kind of exciting. The first tomato, the first cucumber, the first watermelon, whatever it is. They had to take that and they had to give it to the Lord. And then it would be for the priest. Anybody see a connection with us today in what we give to God? First 10%. Our tithe is our first fruit. We give God a percent of what we make first before we pay for anything else. And that would be the first fruits. And then the last one would be the feast of ingathering. That's the harvest. That would be at the end of the season. That's not harvest. That's supposed to be harvest with a bracket around it. I'll just take that off. So first fruit, first things they pick were dedicated to God, given to God. At the last, when all the harvests that have been done, for anyone again who's been any farming or anything, you pick continually throughout the season, and then as you get near the end of the season, whatever's left on the vine you take, and then it gets tilled in. And if you remember the story of Ruth, she went out to glean at the end of the harvest, and one of the rules that went with this harvest, and we'll discuss this next time, was that you were not to harvest to the furthest ends of your plot. Let's say you had 5 acres and you were out there gathering the corn. When you wouldn't go to the corners. You would maybe round off the corners, or once you harvested a section, you didn't go back and redo that for anything that you missed. What you were to do, you were to leave it for the poor and for the foreigners in the land. And that's what Ruth did. Ruth come back to Bethlehem with Naomi, and Naomi told her, go and harvest or reap in the field of Boaz, because Boaz was her kinsman redeemer. So she went, and she was able to pick up the grain that the reapers left. Anything they would drop, when they would bundle up the wheat, tie it up in a bundle, and they would carry it away. Maybe there'd be 2 or 3 sheaves that would fall. The poor and the foreigners were allowed to come and gather that up without any repercussions from the landowner. And he was not supposed to harvest the very corners either, to leave room for them. So you can see this feast was a celebration of all that God had given to them. I don't know, anybody have an idea what we could determine that for us? Income tax return, I don't know, something in our lives that we've had a good year and we had an abundance and we have some left. At this portion, instead of gathering it all in for ourselves, we leave some for people. Maybe it's the time of the year after you've had a good year and you recognize that, I've had a really good year, I have this surplus, maybe it's time to share it with somebody. And you give someone a gift, anonymous gift to someone. So in this one, you're honoring God for providing for you. And the best way to honor him is with your first fruit. This one, you're celebrating the harvest, which, we do a fall festival, which would be kind of a late year celebration, although, the world's kind of turned it into Halloween. But this one, you not only are celebrating what God has provided for you, you also share them with those that don't have as much. And that would be one of the stipulations for this feast. All right, let me do these last two sections. So we've covered, just as a review for you, we've covered the government that God gave to them. That would be our first item. The second was he gave the 10 Commandments, which was the instructions for the people. And then along with that, he gave us a civil law. And then we just looked at the feast. So there's two more areas I want to share with you, and then we'll call it evening. And again, I would like to be able to come back to some of these feasts and spend a little bit of time as exactly what they were involved in. So our fifth area that God provided or set for them was the ritual law. I'll go ahead and put the sixth one down. Okay, so the ritual law, this is, Melissa, this is what you were asking about before. When you get to looking at Leviticus, you're going to see all of the ritual laws, which would include all the vestments, all the things that the priests would do, how they would offer the sacrifices, what kind of sacrifices could be used, the priest's clothing, what they had to wear, the types of animals, and also in there's the instructions on how Moses was to build the tabernacle in the wilderness. We spent, in Sunday school class, we spent about a year or so studying the tabernacle, and it was just so interesting, all the intricacies, everything in that tabernacle, you could find some symbolism or type of Jesus in there. The holy place, all the sacrifices, all the things that went on as a ritual, as a routine ritual that they had to do. God gave that to the Levites to perform all these things. And all of them had a significance as to their relationship with God. And in the foreign affairs, just kind of a little side note, what we talked about before, the Feast of Harvest, they were to leave some for the poor and the foreigners. So God even had, and there was other things, and we'll look at it a little bit later, but there was other things about foreigners. They were not to intermarry. If a foreigner come into the land, they were to treat them hospitable. They were excluded from some of the rituals and those things, but God gave specific instructions on how they were to deal with foreigners that came. Oftentimes they would have, foreigners would be servants or slaves for them. And when the Israelites come out of Egypt, remember what we said, there were 600,000 men plus the women and children, and a multitude of, what did it say, a multitude of others. And that multitude of others, it could have been anyone from Egyptians that said, you know what, I think they got a better track than we do. God's destroyed our land. What's the sense in us staying here? Let's go with them. Or it could be, remember Joseph? He was sold into slavery in Egypt. So maybe there were slaves that saw an opportunity to get out of Egypt. Hey, they're never going to see us with that 600,000 or that million people. We'll just kind of blend in with them and leave. So God said there was a multitude of others that came out with them. So it could have been any of those, or any of the nations around there that had been captured and were serving Egypt. They saw an opportunity to get out, and they went with this group. Now, they may have been some that decided when they got in the wilderness and there was no food, no water, they missed the leeks and the meat pots, maybe they went back, I don't know. But God had provisions for them also into how they were to be treated and taken care of if they chose to stay. So those are the 6 things, if you will, that this law provided for them, the structure. So we saw that, and I'll try to wrap this up with this. God gave them a government, so there would be rule and not chaos. There were people who were responsible to do the right things. He gave them their law. And when you think about the Ten Commandments, it's, you've heard people say, we don't always need to go by the letter of the law, but we can go by the spirit of the law. Even today, I mean, that's why we have court cases. If it was just the letter of the law, you're either guilty or you're innocent. Or if you did some damage to my reputation or to my house, the law doesn't spell out specifically in numbers how I'm to be compensated. So there's that letter that says, okay, if you violate me in whatever way, in word or speech or action, there's a restitution that's to be made, but you might have to go to court and let a jury of your peers determine what that compensation would be. There's some guidelines. Many times if you're injured in a car accident, insurance companies would be prepared to pay you 3 times your medical costs and your lost wages as compensation, but other times you have to go to court and the jury will decide the monetary amount. So that's the difference between the letter and the spirit. The spirit can't be spelled out. There has to be some area where it's determined what did the law mean. And we know what happens when the argument gets further and further along. Where do we end up going? The Supreme Court. That would be the final say in many things concerning our Constitution and the relationship between states. For something to be at the Supreme Court, it has to be something between states or something in violation of the Constitution. That's what they are to decide. There's lower courts that decide the things in the state. Okay? So God had his plan in place. He had all of this. And I don't always like to think that God sat down and said, okay, what am I going to do with these people once I break them out of there? He already knew it was all planned. If planned is the right word, I think it's more of his omniscience. He knew what was to be done. And he presented that to them, and he said, you do this, I'll do that. I mean, we all do that all the time. We go to work, I'll work for you, you pay me. Whatever it would be. So as there's quite a bit more I want to cover on the law. Just a couple more pages of notes. But this is that literature aspect of the Bible. We saw the narrative part. Now we'll see how important the law was. And again, law means all of it, not just the Ten Commandments. Everything that has to do with the relationships with one another, relationships with God. The tricky part for us, when we read something in the New Testament and they refer to the law, they know what part of the law that this person that's speaking is talking about. We would have to do a little research. Okay, is he talking about relationships with one another, or is he talking about how I have to pay taxes to Caesar? Whatever it would be that would be involved. So I'm hoping in this that we'll see how much more the law is than just do's and don'ts. Okay? Father, we do thank you for this, Lord, and it's so much, Lord. It's so much to comprehend all that you gave to the nation of Israel, Lord, and all that you give to us, Lord. And even in that old covenant, there were many things. We know also, Lord, that in this new covenant, this greater covenant, you provide for us in so many ways, Lord, and all you ask is obedience to you. And we thank you for that, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen.